Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Thursday, December 7th, 2023. Scot Horton from antiwar.com joins us now. Scott, always a pleasure, my dear friend. Thank you for joining us. Isn't the war in Ukraine effectively over, and hasn't Ukraine effectively lost that? And isn't that the below the radar consensus of military people and even some of the globalists in Europe?
Yes, sir. I believe that, as they would put it, and I would agree, it's a stalemate. It's I don't know if Russia tried, if they could just march west. It seems like the Ukrainian military strength is not completely broken, but the question really at issue is whether they have the ability to force the Russians out. And the answer is no. In fact, I'm sure, as you remember, Judge, it was at the beginning of November last year. So, 13 months ago, that after the Ukrainians had actually had a pretty decent success on the ground when they did a feint in their maneuver to take back I believe, virtually all of Kharkiv province and a little bit of northern Luhansk, as well as about half of Kherson, and force the Russians back across the river at Kherson. And at that time, the American chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, said, all right, you boys this is as good as it's going to get. Congratulations. You should quit right now while you're only this far behind and not further behind. I'm paraphrasing, but that was the message.
Right.
And it was Blinken and Sullivan, who've never been in a fist fight in their life, who said, don't listen to the generals. What do they know? We have a plan. And the plan was, remember, we're going to do a winter offensive, but then it was never cold enough for the ground to freeze solid for them to send in the armor. It was all just mud. So they had to wait. And then the spring rains came. So the spring offensive, well, they had to put that off too. And so the ground didn't finally dry out until June. And then the summer offensive went absolutely nowhere. And Judge, honestly, it's informative as it is disgraceful, or maybe it's not that informative. It's maybe only informative not in the analysis of the war, unless you're new at this, but it's informative as far as the thinking in Washington to read the 2-part series in the Washington Post that says, yep, it didn't work. And the judge was right. And Colonel McGregor was right. Oh, they don't say that, but they say the surge went nowhere, right? It was some sort of force up against an irresistible object. At this point, the Russians had taken this amount of territory in those 4 provinces, and were now on the defensive. And the question was whether the Ukrainians were going to be able to launch an offensive against them and drive them out. And at that point, no way, way too late. And the defenses were just way too built in. And the Ukrainians claim that the Americans sold them out and didn't give them all the weapons they promised. That's probably true. But all the weapons they promised weren't going to make the difference here. And anyone could just look at a map and tell you that Russia was going to win this war sooner or later. And it was the people, remember, Judge, 2 years ago and change, the people who were the ones mongering this war, who said that we were all on Russia's side and we hated the people of Ukraine and didn't care what happened to them. And when we were the ones saying, no, you're going to get them killed and get their country destroyed, and they're going to end up losing these provinces anyway, only now under harsher terms. And of course, as we're discussing this at the beginning of December of 2023, they control most of 4 provinces, not 2. And And the question is, and including Crimea, it's 5. And the question is whether they're going to give any of that territory up, or whether the negotiation is going to end up being, okay, listen, just hold on to what you have, but please don't take any more at this point. And it's America who, the U.S. empire, I should say, not the American people, of course, the people who run our national security state, pretended to be these people's friends and got them into this mess. That they were sure to lose and at their expense. And then who knows about the blowback? Because it is a real betrayal here. It's like the Bay of Pigs or the Shiite uprising of 91, where America encourages these people to fight and then stabs them in the back.
Right.
And, could be got a president killed over the Bay of Pigs
So
betrayal.
what?
And we know
as-
we got our towers knocked down ultimately over the consequences of the betrayal of the Shiite uprising in 91 and then the occupation of Saudi after that. Now, what have we done? We built up and stabbed in the back a bunch of Hitler-loving Nazis, Judge. The Azov Battalion, C-14, and all of these groups who are, not like in American media lies about American conservatives. These are real Hitler-loving Nazis. A lot of them, the descendants of those who served Hitler in the Second World War and helped accomplish the Holocaust. And some of the worst of the Holocaust took place in Ukraine, Judge. Somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million Jews were killed by the Germans and with their Ukrainian collaborators in that war. These are the grandsons. These are the legacy that the American national security state since Obama has been grooming there, and that we now are leaving high and dry. So I'm sure it'll be fine, though.
As we speak, the Congress is at loggerheads and at each other's throats over whether or not to send another $68 billion there. What the hell good is another $68 billion? They have 500,000 casualties, according to Colonel McGregor. That's either deaths or injuries so severe that the person can't come back into active duty military. They've closed the borders so you can't leave. They've instituted a draft of both genders from age 17 to age 70. I mean, this is really absurd. And they've canceled presidential elections, they being the Zelensky regime, for 2024. What is $68 billion going to do for them militarily? I know they're going to steal it, but what are they going to do with it militarily?
Yeah, I mean, look, I have to tell you, Judge, I really don't know. And I owe y'all the research. I really should do a better job of trying to find out just what is, as best as I can, open source, what is the troop strength in Ukraine right now. I know there was a report, I believe this was in the Post, certainly easy to find, big round number, 160,000 fighting age males, that is conscript age males, have fled the country to the west. Never mind anybody's fled into Russia to the east, but have fled to the west to get out of there so they don't have to fight this war. And they say also in the Post that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who Seymour Hersh says is talking on back channels to the Russians as a precursor to negotiations, and is seen as more reasonable, although I don't know if that's really true, but he's seen as more reasonable than Zelensky, that he is now a favored candidate, I should say, to oppose Zelensky and replace him, because Zelensky is seen more and more as a loose cannon. And there was that story in Time magazine where his own people are saying that he's lost it. He refuses to acknowledge the delusional situation.
Yeah, one of his close aides called him delusional. Here's somebody.
Well, the mayor of Kiev, Klitschko, who was important in the Maidan Revolution of 2014, just outright denounced him and said he's acting like a dictator and all this kind of stuff. So it seems like a severe undermining of his authority and credibility there.
I think it's clear to say his authority is undermined, and he's probably planning for the next phase of his life. Here's somebody who thinks it should be a given that he can spend the $68 billion that Congress is fighting over whether or not to give him. You're going to love this clip from the president yesterday.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to speak to you today about an urgent responsibility the Congress has to uphold the national security needs of the United States, and quite frankly, of our partners as well. This cannot wait. Congress needs to pass supplemental funding for Ukraine before they break for the holiday resources. As simple as that. Frankly, I think it's stunning that we've gotten to this point in the first place. While Republicans in Congress are willing to give Putin the greatest gift he could hope for and abandon our global leadership, not just in Ukraine, but beyond that. If Putin takes Ukraine, he won't stop there. It's important to see the long run here. He's going to keep going. He's made that pretty clear. If Putin attacks a NATO ally, then we'll have something that we don't seek and that we don't have today. American troops fighting Russian troops. American troops fighting Russian troops if he moves into other parts of NATO. Extreme Republicans are playing chicken with our national security, holding Ukraine's funding hostage to their extreme partisan border policies. And now they're willing to literally kneecap Ukraine on the battlefield and damage our national security in the process. Look, I know we have our divisions at home. Let's get past them. This is critical. Petty, partisan, angry politics can't get in the way of our responsibility as a leading nation in the world. We can't let Putin win. Say it again, we can't let Putin win. It's in our overwhelming national interest and international interest of all our friends.
How many tired, old, discredited theories did he wrap into that bundle, Scott?
God, pretty much all of them, it sounded like, Judge. And, all of it is begging the question and, just making broad claims. I mean, first of all, you notice he had to skip a few from Ukraine to if Putin attacks a NATO ally. But what the hell is he talking about? What he said before that was not a lead up to that. It was a total non sequitur. He was just talking about Ukraine. It's not like he said, tensions have been growing worse and worse, higher and higher between Russia and Lithuania.
Right. And Putin's threatening to attack.
Yeah. He's not even talking about it. He says, yeah, so he can just make up anything at that point, right? If China jumps in the war, then it'll be a whole new thing, Judge. Yeah, well, okay. If grandma had boy parts, she'd be grandpa. What are we talking about here? And look, and what he's doing is he's lying, right? He wants you to believe that what's going on here is just Vladimir Putin stealing things. But that's stupid and wrong. And again, I plead guilty because I owe you guys a book. And the thing is 1,000 pages long and it ain't done yet, but it's called Provoked. And it's about how the U.S. government, that is Bush Sr., Clinton, Bush, Obama, yes, Trump, despite himself, and certainly the regime under him while he was in power, and Joe Biden, they're the ones who caused this problem. And it doesn't excuse what Vladimir Putin did, but if this is a bar fight, America put his back to the wall. Maybe not all the way in a corner, but you know what? You put a guy's back to the wall, he might not wait till you get him all the way in a corner. And they knew what they were doing, Judge. We've talked about this before. They said openly, you know what, Putin, you better not do it. But they weren't willing to negotiate and make sure that he wouldn't. Instead, they said, you know what, if he does, we're going to turn this into Afghanistan. We're going to bog him down, bleed him to bankruptcy, and it'll be a strategic advantage to us to bankrupt them and hurt them in all these ways. But again, who are we talking about? We're talking about Joe Biden. I can't even believe I'm saying this. The president of the United States is Joe Biden, for God's sake, and backed up by Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, who was Hillary Clinton's guy, and Victoria Nuland, who's Robert Kagan's wife. And these people are as crazy as they are ignorant, inept, and they thought that this was smart. Yeah, what we'll do, Judge, is we'll get Russia in a bunch of trouble instead of, hey, our priority needs to be, open and calm and peaceful diplomatic relationship with Russia at all costs, other than, truly selling out our own national interests. But even in terms of selling out the Ukrainians, again, it was Obama in the Maiden Revolution of 14, Bush before that, but especially Obama in the Maiden Revolution of 14, that forced this issue, that overthrew a democratically elected government and installed a new junta that, yeah, they hold elections, excluding the eastern half of the country. This is completely illegitimate. And as Putin correctly said, not because he's great, but just because it's true, that this is a colonial government. It's a sock puppet government controlled by American Britain, and it has been for 10 years. And they had a peace deal, as I know that I think you and I have talked about, and certainly you've talked about with your other guests on the show over the couple of years here.
Until Boris Johnson showed up and said, don't worry, we have your back, tear up the peace deal.
Well, no, even going back to 14 and 15, they had these Minsk deals that they were supposed to implement, and yet they had the radical right-wingers, again, these neo-Nazis, threatened to kill President Poroshenko, and then they threatened to kill President Zelensky if they would implement the peace deal. And anyone can look that up. I mean, Radio Free America covered it. The Nazis are threatening to kill the president of Ukraine today because he's trying to live up to the negotiation he already signed. They threatened to do that to Poroshenko, and it was a credible threat. Even the New York Times said, hey, when these guys threaten to overthrow the president, they make a point. They did overthrow the government before. They could do it again. And they said, Zelensky will hang from a lamppost if he lives up to the deal. At that point, you want to talk about American support for Ukraine, Judge. That's where America could have helped Zelensky round up and arrest the leaders of the Nazi groups and say, you can't threaten me. I'm the monopoly on force here, not you. What did he do? He bowed down to them and ended up sending them to war.
I don't think there's much dispute about the history as you've recited it. But do the elites in D.C. and Brussels recognize that they were wrong from the beginning? How could they have gotten it so wrong? I mean, we're talking about $100 billion, and old Joe wants to throw in another 60 or 70.
I mean, if you go back to the Munich conference I'm sorry, I can't remember which month it was. I think it was very early this year of 23, Judge, where they were frustrated that everyone, it was a split between everyone who was recognizing the reality that, this is never going to work versus those who were still hell-bent on the narrative that we have to somehow see this through. And there was a commitment to the narrative, right? Our position was that we're going to drive the Russians out of, they would say, every last square inch of Ukraine, retake that whole country. And then the question sometimes, and sometimes not, but oftentimes including Crimea, right? Nothing short of total Russian defeat and humiliation and capitulation will do here. And I have to believe, Judge, that, never mind, I don't know, whichever nitwit, hosts on CNN or whatever, but when it comes to the actual decision makers here, they had to have known that that was a lie. They had to have known that that was never going to happen. It was instead, I think, the idea was just drag the defeat out, make it a war of attrition where ultimately Russia may get this or that, but we're at least going to make it hurt and cost them to do so.
You're so articulate on all of this. I got to prevail on you on the other hot spot. Recently, the New York Times reported that Israeli intelligence had a roadmap to the Hamas invasion, including the very 60 places at which Hamas fighters breached the wall that Israel has installed to confine the Gazans in Gaza. Mm-hmm. A year before this happened. Do you believe that? Could there have been such a colossal, catastrophic indifference on the part of Israeli intelligence that they just didn't care what this report said?
Yes. Now, I have to clarify a couple things. First of all, you're right. It is a New York Times story, but it's not by Charlie Savage, the ridiculous, discredited liar. It's by a guy named Ronan Bergman. And he is the author of Rise and Kill First, which is this deeply researched insider account of the secret wars of Israel's Mossad and their military and all this going back years. And so he's a real credible reporter. I'd put a lot of stake in it. And he says in that story that he's seen this document. He's held it in his hands. And people have to realize, again, I always try to reiterate, because I know people don't always understand this, that Palestine is not the country next door. Palestine is conquered and occupied and replaced by Israel here. The Gaza Strip and the West Bank are essentially reservations where what's, the last 22% of what's left of Palestine, where the refugees live. And so, in other words, they are completely pwned by Israel, right? And so, of course, Israel had the war plan. The place is under total surveillance beyond Edward Snowden's worst fevered nightmare. They know everything going on there, Judge. So, of course, they had the war plan. And yes, I believe Ronan Bergman when he writes that he's seen the dang thing. All and right. Then they said in there that this was said to have been circulated throughout the highest levels of the Israeli government. And they don't know whether Netanyahu himself saw it, but that essentially the consensus was, and they're not going to do anything. Hezbollah, those guys are tough. Hamas, meh. And they're just a bunch of punks. And see, also, you have to understand too, Judge, the broader context, is that the Netanyahu Doctrine is half make peace with the Sunni Arab kingdoms but including without making peace with the Palestinians, which had always been the stipulation before. And part of not making peace with the Palestinians is keeping the Palestinians divided and conquered physically in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, of course, but also politically, where as long as Hamas is in control of the Gaza Strip, then they are the perfect scapegoats so that Netanyahu and the Israeli government and their partisans can say quite correctly that these guys are terrorists. You don't expect us to negotiate with a bunch of terrorists, do you? And then as Netanyahu famously instructed his own Likud party members, don't worry, we control the height of the flames. So yes, Hamas are these dangerous terrorists, but of course we're in charge and we can make sure that one, they're useful for demonizing the Palestinians and preventing negotiations toward a Palestinian independent state. But two, we have the power to keep them in their pen and to prevent them from harming Israelis. But then, so what happened? There are a lot of reasons why it fell apart, Judge. I'll try to do it really bullet pointy, but Netanyahu, remember, was under indictment. He's going to go to prison. And he had to make a coalition with all these completely ridiculous religious right-wing kooks in these parties that he would never join in a coalition with before. But now he did because he had to stay in office so he didn't have to go to jail. And so, because actual, prime ministers go to jail over there. Ehud Olmert went to jail,
Right.
which is unbelievable in America, but it, happens there. But anyway, and so he had to join up with these kooks, and these guys are real kooks, and they've been pushing for radical expansion in the West Bank all year long, as well as they had held this Scot Harvest Festival on the West Bank that they had been forbidden from doing before, and that had required the removal of hundreds of IDF soldiers away from the Gaza fence area and to the West Bank to babysit these settlers stealing Palestinian land and these religious kooks doing their ceremonies, and including raiding the Al-Aqsa Mosque and all these things. These are the massive provocations of this year before October the 7th. As part of that, and part of that, Judge, was moving more and more assets away from Gaza to the West Bank to babysit these settlers. And then more and more around Gaza, they're relying on artificial intelligence, gizmos and sensors, and literally, like in Idiocracy, literally automatic machine guns and all of these things to keep the Palestinians in their pen. And then the New York Times, I mean, if you could believe it, I don't know, it seemed credible to me. They had this extensive piece about how the first thing that Hamas did was they hit all of these communication centers and towers with drones and blew them up. And they just right off the bat completely blinded the IDF and destroyed the sensors on the fence and the control towers where they could communicate back with headquarters and so forth, and just caught them completely with their pants down on a Saturday morning by taking advantage of their dereliction and their hubris.
Let me play another version of this for you by our friend Max Blumenthal, who is 100% with you and me and people watching now.
He's so great
on the atrocities, but he has a nuanced, a slightly different view of that piece in the New York Times, and I want you to hear this and comment on it.
I want to be careful with this because a lot of this reporting is coming from sources that want Netanyahu out, that are trying to make him take the fall for a failure that was extended well beyond him and his little political network, and reached deep into the military intelligence apparatus. And so, you look at the New York Times reports and who's leading them. It's a guy named Ronan Bergman. He's an Israeli reporter, and he wrote a book called Rise Up and Kill, which is a history of Israel's assassination policy. You look at who blurbed that book. It's many of the security chiefs, the former Mossad and Shin Bet chiefs, who are leading the campaign against Netanyahu, and they're his sources. So I think what actually happened was that the Palestinian counterintelligence and Hamas's political leadership, led by Yahya Sinwar, who spent much of his life, maybe most of his life, in an Israeli prison, tricked the Israelis and tricked Netanyahu into believing that they had no plans to attack, that they just wanted an economic peace. And they managed to pull off a major intelligence coup.
What do you think?
Well, I would have to see the rest of that interview. I did see a major portion of that. Did you interview him twice or something? Because I missed that.
No. I interviewed him earlier this week, and we just excerpted
Okay.
that clip. You
Well,
both
listen,
have an extraordinary knowledge of the facts and of the lay of the land.
well,
It
him
just
much
has a
more
little
than me,
different
Judge.
view.
I mean, I have to say, he moved to Israel and lived there for 3 years to write his book Goliath. He went to Gaza during and right after
Great.
the 51-day war in 2014, and he's a real expert. I defer to him on a lot, and I would only hold my horses there. I'd like to hear the rest of that as far as if he. And I just want to see exactly what he's talking
Well,
about. If he's
the
saying,
interview is posted on
okay,
my YouTube
but do I
site. I just wanted to play that little clip for you.
sure? Well, do I understand right that he was saying that he thinks the entire operation on the 7th was arranged between Hamas and Mossad at Netanyahu's expense?
No. He thinks that Hamas tricked Mossad and Netanyahu
Oh,
into
okay.
a
Yeah.
false
That's
sense of
much better.
security. So
Yeah.
it's not very far from your view.
Well, and Mossad is now hanging Netanyahu out to dry for what's their failure too.
Correct.
I would definitely endorse that. Yes, the
Correct.
entire national security state there is absolutely as guilty as hell. However, and this should be emphasized, and I'm sure there are faction fights too. Remember, we learned from the Discord leak that Mossad and Biden were working to support the protests against Netanyahu. So, believe me, look, if I was a Mossad agent or like Shin Bet National Police, I'd hate Netanyahu too. This guy's
You're
driving
so
the country
smart.
into the ground.
We've
Right,
all
so-
forgotten about the Discord leak. That's the kid, Jack Teixeira on Cape Cod.
Yeah, well, and it showed Biden siding with Mossad against the prime
Correct.
minister there, and
Correct.
and that the protests were essentially a sock puppet operation, a color-coded revolution, maybe by the national security state. But Netanyahu, I think, look, they call him King Bibi. He's the longest-serving prime minister in Israeli history, longer than David Ben-Gurion, and I think I used this analogy before. Imagine if September 11th had happened during Bill Clinton's 3rd term instead of during, only 8 months into W. Bush when hardly anyone could expect him to do his job by then. But if it had been Bill Clinton's 3rd term, then of course it would have been his fault. Of course it's his fault. He's been turning a blind eye to and backing these Mujahideen type terrorists for years, even as they're attacking us. And now they got a big one on us, and it just would have all fallen on him, the butcher of Waco, the butcher in New York City, because of his criminal negligence. And the same thing, see, if you just switch out W. Bush, the entire U.S. national security state was absolutely responsible for 3,000 counts of criminally negligent homicide in the 1st degree, for that thing even being within realms of possible to happen to the United States of America. And the same thing here.
You're right on, Scott.
Yes, Netanyahu
go,
and everyone at the National Police, the IDF, that's the Shin Bet, the IDF and Mossad, all of those leaders ought to be hung completely out to dry for what's happened here.
We'll see how it ends. My dear friend, you're so smart. You're so articulate. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us.
Happy to do it anytime. Thank you, Judge.
All the best. Professor John Mearsheimer tomorrow and the Intelligence Roundtable. Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.